There is no version of the world where every country has all the natural resources it needs to survive and thrive. What we have to address is less of a food shortage and more of a crisis of prioritization.
New York-based and Ethiopia-born Sara Menker lives at the intersection of agriculture, economics, and technology. A former Wall Street trader, she is the founder and CEO of Grow Intelligence, which uses AI to forecast agricultural trends. In 2017, Sara Menker predicted a global food crisis. Conversations on the Future focuses on fundamental existential issues beyond the daily news. In this conversation, Sara Menker shares her thoughts on addressing global food security at a time of critical, converging challenges.
Commodity markets, whether agriculture or energy or anything else, if you're either facing a supply shock or a demand shock. In energy markets, the demand shock tends to come in the form of weather. Too hot in the summer, and so cooling demand of homes goes up, and so electricity generation goes up and we use a lot more energy. Or in the winter, it gets too cold and you have a cold spell and people need to heat their homes extra, and there's sort of extra demand and excess demand, so that volatility tends to be linked to the demand side. On agriculture, the volatility tends to be linked to the supply side because it's droughts or floods or so climate related events tend to disrupt the supply side of the agricultural supply chain, and that's what tends to drive it. We've had an unprecedented number of supply side shocks just due to climate. But then you've also had something else happen, which is very rarely do you actually have supply and demand shocks happening at the same time. And COVID really introduced a new layer of complexity to our supply chains by introducing more than just climate as supply shocks, because it was just supply chain shocks of being able to get things from point A to point B, etc. And then we also faced an unprecedented amount of demand shocks that occurred, whether it was people stocking up their homes, but then it became structural in nature in terms of how some of the shifts happened. So definitely the volatility, and then you had a war. It's a combination of man-made plus Mother Nature.
How concerned should we be about currency volatility, currency shifts?
Well, the sort of US dollar and the strength of the US dollar, that alone has had pretty significant economic consequences for countries around the world. It's forget the price of commodities and whether it's agriculture or energy prices being up, etc. Just that currency shift factor has led to serious inflationary pressures around the world. I mean, look at Argentina, it's falling apart. So to me, the ability for countries to essentially repay their debt and to keep their balance sheets healthy is going to be a significant challenge in sort of the next year to 2 years.
You've spoken of 5 major challenges occurring simultaneously, each individually extraordinary. And this is from your briefing to the UN Security Council earlier this year. You said, without substantial, immediate and aggressive coordinated global action, we stand the risk of an extraordinary amount of human suffering and economic damage. It's a seismic event, you said. Are we beginning to see the kind of actions that you think that are necessary to deal with this?
I would say one of the biggest sort of global coordinated actions taken was figuring out how to get Odessa reopened. While it's not sort of running at sort of full capacity and back to sort of 100%, the fact that any grain is moving out of Ukraine is not an inconsequential sort of accomplishment, I would say, in terms of, when there's a will, there's a way. There was a way there, and I think that got accomplished. I would say that would be probably the biggest relief valve that sort of the agricultural markets have seen in the past few months. Is that enough? No. And the reason is that a lot of the other challenges continue to persist. If we start sort of looking at climate shocks and an unprecedented number of climate shocks, over 25% of cropland around the world today is actually facing drought. That's the highest it's been in over 20 plus years. And then on top of that, where there isn't drought in places like Pakistan, you continue to have extreme shocks on the opposite end, which is extreme floods and flooding, sort of destroying agricultural commodities, right? And that's where we have less immediate coordinated action that can be taken. There's long-term action we need to take as society to avoid things getting worse on the climate's end of the spectrum. But the best we can do there is be better prepared, for sort of what's coming in the immediate sort of short-term future. If I look at fertilizer and fertilizer markets, that is in a really difficult position today. And that's mostly because of natural gas prices. So 70 to 90% of the cost of fertilizer, at least nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are an important type of fertilizer, the cost of that is linked to the cost of natural gas. And because of the war in Ukraine and Russia cutting off gas supplies into Western Europe, that has caused a lot of fertilizer plants to shut down. If they're not fully shut down, they're running at 20 to 30% capacity. And that presents a major challenge for next year. The southern hemisphere, places like major producers like Argentina, Brazil, had already purchased their fertilizer. So that's all well and good. But in going into next year, we could have some really significant challenges of just availability of fertilizer. Because despite gas prices and despite high gas prices, a lot of fertilizer companies sold what they had in inventory and destocked sort of this sort of past year and a half. And so what happens sort of in 2023, 2024, because of fertilizer shortages, I think is a major challenge, and it's linked to energy markets. Sticking to the topic of energy markets, I talked in sort of my speech about vegetable oils. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a deep connection between energy markets and vegetable oils as well, which is biofuels. So we increasingly use a lot of our food crops to produce oil, to drive our cars, and to produce biofuels. In the US, it's corn. In Asia and Southeast Asia, it's palm oil. In Brazil, it's sugar. So between ethanol and biodiesel, we are consuming a lot of food calories as fuel calories. But that's also because right now, in particular, it's driven by two main things. One is this tension between ecological preservation and economic growth as an alternative to traditional oil and gas sources, essentially. Instead of conventional oil, ethanol, biofuel became cleaner alternatives, but have consequential challenges for humanity in sort of different ways. And so, there has been quite a relief to the vegetable oil markets since the speech, but it's not because of good reasons. It's because of economic damage. Mm. So, sometimes there's a saying that says the cure to high prices is high prices, meaning at some point prices just get too high and people don't buy it, and there's sufficient demand destruction. Also, and I think there was a sufficient demand destruction in Asia, where palm oil demand is high, and China was in lockdown for a significant part of this year.
We are in a third consecutive La Nina event, and we're seeing wildfires, California, the usual thing. What do you see happening in Asia in relation to La Nina and also the general issue of climate change? How is it going to affect Asia?
3 years of La Nina is not normal. And you want to look at it globally because, see, Asia is a net importer of so much from the rest of the world, and particularly from the US and Brazil and Argentina. The biggest things that happen are always not in your backyard. It's in the places you're not looking, and that's where you get caught by surprise. And so with the third year of La Nina, the biggest challenge is sort of dryness in the US, which we've seen this summer. But actually that's now translating also into Brazil and Argentina. It does actually mean more precipitation in regions like Australia that are anticipated to have very healthy harvests. But on a relative basis, Australia is actually a much smaller producer than sort of the big three that I just mentioned. And so three consecutive years of La Nina and drought in basically both North and South America is a real challenge.
I see that India has recently restricted rice exports. India is the largest exporter of rice in the world. How do you see the rice crop being affected in this part of the world, which is 1+ billion people?
Yeah, I mean, it's also the largest producer of rice in the world, collectively between India, Pakistan, China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So if you think about one of the things about the rice markets, unlike all the other commodity crops, unlike corn, wheat, vegetable oils, it was actually quite immune to any price movements over the last couple of years. So it's the one that faced the least inflationary pressures and the least shocks as it related to climate. Like harvests were actually quite healthy consecutively. And so nobody was paying attention to rice. That rice was in sort of this really good place. The problem with rice is that it's such a staple crop that, you know, a major shock to a couple of the major producing countries has pretty big sort of ripple effects, right? And so I think we saw that happening with India, with Pakistan. I think the current estimates are it's lost 10%. The chances are it's much higher because the damage oftentimes comes in the form of disease as well. And, you know, there's all sorts of other damage that happens to sort of the food crop that makes it inedible. You also have China, which is facing droughts in its rice growing regions. So the heat waves that China experienced this summer didn't affect all crops. Crops like corn were actually okay, but rice is actually the most affected. So to me, the thing that's actually in some ways most complicated about rice is that it is, you know, it is a staple crop for most of the countries who are also the exporters. If you look at India and where India stands in the export market, it's the number one exporter of rice in the world. But it's so large as a number one exporter that its exports are larger than the second, third, and fourth largest exporters combined, right? So any restriction from India has big ramifications in and of itself.
There's also this issue of countries sort of trying to withdraw from globalization, so to speak, to insulate themselves, decouple, become energy independent, import independent, and so forth. How do you see that trend going forward?
It's a dangerous trend because it's actually very hard to decouple in a way that is cost effective. So if people are worried about sort of inflation now, wait till you see what it means for inflation when you try to decouple from the global economy. It will just, nobody wins from that.
You have spoken often of Africa, and I've heard you tell about how you started Grow Intelligence, and you had folks back in Silicon Valley rather impressed that there was not just entrepreneurship, but digital literacy, innovation coming out of Africa. And a lot of people see Africa as rising. What is your prediction for Africa?
A lot has changed in the last 8 years, even from when I started Grow, which is, you know, the tech ecosystem has flourished across the continent, whether you're looking at, you know, places like Nairobi, which is where I started Grow, but Lagos, you know, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Accra. I mean, you're just seeing innovation occurring really across all the cities, despite the odds, and really attracting international capital now. It used to be that there was a sort of a niche venture capital industry that was very dedicated to just funding African startups, but they typically had very small funds, so they could never help scale. Whereas now, sort of the big, sort of major funds just view it as another region, another market opportunity. So, and I think that that's great because, you know, I think innovation that comes out of different circumstances helps people build companies differently for the world. And I think having that diversity in sort of the products that we interface with, interact with, is healthy. And Africa had been behind on that, especially in things like payments, technologies, etc., is really sort of rising to the forefront.
You have an extraordinarily multinational team at Grow Intelligence, and it struck me that it's almost like a model for how we should be moving forward. We need collective global action cross-cultural, cross-political systems in order to deal with existential global issues like climate change, for example. So it's almost like you have that team at Grow. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
You know, I've always viewed it as it was a necessity, it was not even an option. You know, we have a saying that's the AI is only as good as the HI behind it, the HI being the human intelligence. And that means that you need to, if you're modeling a complex real world system, which is what we are doing, the people modeling it must resemble the world you are modeling. or else you'll model it incorrectly. And for us, it meant making sure that we had the right mix of people in terms of academic backgrounds, whether it's bringing in hydrologists and plant scientists and climate scientists from the top academic institutions in the world, but having them work side by side with people who worked at hedge funds for 20 plus years. Bringing in sort of market research analysts or farm operators as part of the team. And then marrying that with world-class engineers and sort of design talent, et cetera, was a necessity. That was the only way that the system would work and has worked as well as it has. But the second part of sort of that complexity for us is that the best data in every part of the world tends to come in the local language, not in English. And so when you're building automated systems to extract that data and to work with it, you still need a layer of human intelligence to actually help with things like translations. Automated translations are horrible when it becomes very domain specific and context specific. It mattered to me from day one that we tracked like languages people spoke. So just in case, it didn't matter what your job description was, but if we were dealing with a source and it was in Arabic, then you say, who speaks Arabic? And you have to look at this thing. It was almost in our DNA and was a necessity to how we built it. I think a lot of AI companies are not built that way. There's that sort of the HI component is maybe not as well looked at, but very few are also built in as sort of a domain as global as ours from day one.
Sara Menker, thank you very much. Fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.